I've been pastoring for quite a few years, and I would say in the top 10 or at least top 5 common questions that I've been asked by believers, by people here in this church or people in other places, is a question about 1 John 3:9. Now, I'm going to look at it first here, and I'm going to use first the CSB, the 2017 edition. It says, everyone who has been born from God does not sin. The King James Version, or AV as it more properly was called, whosoever is born from God does not, or doth, let's say in King James English, doth not commit sin. You see why these two, or these translations would encourage people to ask a question, because when it says there, everyone who is born from God does not sin, I mean, you just read it like that on face value. A lot of people are going, well, wait a second. I sinned yesterday. Now what do I do? Am I in trouble? Oh. And we're going to take a look at that today and try to understand what it is that John is saying. I'm Pastor Tim Holscher. We're working verse by verse through 1 John. We're in chapter 3, of course, as already saw here as we introduced this in verse 9. I did a video on this, I don't know, probably 2 years ago. And I had a lot of people that sent me questions on this, people that I knew, and they were saying this. And so here we go. We already introduced 2 translations here, and I'm not trying to be hard on those translations. I'm just saying the way they translate this does sometimes maybe lead us to the question, well, what's going on then? I want to go over and I want to look at the New American Standard. This is the 1995 translation, and they say no one was born from God practices sin. Now, why do they do this practice? We talked about this, I think, maybe the last couple days in these studies. But they're using practice because we have the verb poieo in here. Poieo means to do or to make. There's different ways. In this case, do. And literally what it says, they do not do sin. Sin is a noun in this case. When we read it over here, everyone who is born from God does not sin. That seems to make it look like sin is a verb. And here does not commit sin. Now this one, I think they're using the word commit here. Probably, I'm guessing the King James translators were using the word commit to translate the word poieo, the word do, and then they're still treating sin as a noun in this case, which it is. But I believe when the New American Standard translates this practices, well, what they're doing is they're trying to help us understand what John is saying by using this word do. And now here's the next part of it. And we've talked about these the last few days, but I want to kind of just demonstrate this a little bit, show you a couple of details that to me are very interesting. I trust that they're helpful to you. But this verb poieo, in this case poiai, because it's he or that one, is in the present tense. Now, for us, present tense just means, well, that's today. And I ate lunch. Well, that was a few hours ago, so that's past tense. And future tense, well, I'm going to eat supper, and because I'm doing this in the afternoon. And so we just think of those things. But for a Greek-speaking person, there was a lot more going on than just where an event happened in time. It had to do with the perspective of the writer, or sometimes the perspective that the writer was trying to cast for the person reading it, anticipating these people that would read it and the perspective or view that the writer wanted them to have when they looked at this. And therefore, their use of the present tense wasn't just that this is just the way it is, it's going on. It oftentimes was just looking at linear activity. It's some people have pictured it. It's like standing on the sidewalk watching a parade go by. You don't see all the parade, but if the parade has already started, you may not see the beginning of it anymore, and you don't see the end of it. And in your mind, you know that there's a beginning and end of that. Well, yeah, it's a parade. It's just an illustration. But you're just seeing the parade taking place. This is perhaps one picture of a use of the present tense. It's looking at this is what you can observe. And does the present tense sometimes refer to present time? Yeah, plainly, sometimes it does, but sometimes the present tense is looking at an event maybe in the past, but it's looking at it with vividness of something that's ongoing. And so there's a number of ways that the present tense can occur. But I want to show you this next aspect of, or the significance of this present tense. I want to pull this up here for a minute. What I've done here is in my Bible program, and some people have asked me what Bible program I use, and I use Accordance Bible software. I've been using Accordance Bible software for, I don't know, I'm going to say close to 20 years. I had like that old version of it way back, but I had problems figuring out how to use it effectively. But I've been using it for 20 years. And if a person, especially if a person lives in the Macintosh or Apple world like I do, I recommend it. It's good software. And I'm trying to advertise for them or anything like that. I'm just recommending. I mean, you can download the app on your phone. I have it on my phone. I have it on my tablet. And I encourage people in our church, if they don't have a good Bible software that they can take along with them, it's not a bad one to download on your phone or on your tablet. And I have a lot of people now, when you tell them to turn in their Bibles, there's not paper turning. They're flipping on their phone to the text you're reading. Anyway, back to the main subject here. I digress a little too much. I'm using Accordance. And what I did was I did a search here, a simple basic grammatical search, where I asked it to look for all the present tense verbs in the New Testament. Here we go. I have statistics. I wrote them on a piece of paper over here. But in the New Testament, when we're looking at the present tense, we have about 11,551 present tense verbs. And that's verbs, participles, proper verbs, participles, and infinitives. Those are kind of the different ways that we, shall we say, have verbs. Over here on the right-hand column, it's one of the things that I really love about this software, and I use this quite often, is I look at word count statistics. And what this is doing is, in this place, it tells you in the book of Matthew, you have this many present tense verbs. Then in this column over here, the column to the right, it tells you how many hits per 1,000 words that is in that book. And so you go down through here, and we see, like in the Gospel of John, he actually has the highest number of present tense verbs, and it's about 102.39 hits per 1,000. Please don't get bored. Just stick with me for a little bit. John's a big book. Matthew's a big book. Mark's a big book. Luke's a big book. And you can understand why they have present tense verbs occurring in the, 1,400, 1,500, almost 1,000. But if we go down and we work through all these books, we come down here to 1 John. 1 John is a very small book. It has 284 present tenses in this book. Now, this is, I think, one of the things that's really significant. It has the highest number of hits per 1,000, the present tense does, in 1 John of any book in the New Testament. 144 hits per 1,000. That means in this book that John's writing, now let's talk about the significance of this. In this book that John is writing, the idea of the present tense is very important to John, because John is talking to these believers that are struggling with this problem of these antichrists that were in their church and have now left, and they've thrown some people into a little bit of a tizzy over what's gone on, some people that are immature. They know truth, but they're a little bit confused about what's gone on. And you can go back and review those videos if you need to earlier on in this series. But he uses a present tense to talk with vividness about your experience, what your experience, not what it could maybe be in the future, but what it is, what it should be. And he uses these present tenses. But he also uses the present tenses to talk about those people who are not believers and to point out this is the way their life is. Stop and think about it. So he says here in verse 9, no one who is born from God practices or does sin. He uses the present tense here of this poieo to say he doesn't sin as just this continuous way of life. Do believers sin? Yes. In fact, in this very letter, John tells us that if a person claims that they don't sin anymore, that it's done, they quit sinning in the past, don't sin now, whatever it might be, they're lying, they're making God a liar, they're deceiving themselves, really, and they're making God a liar. So, yeah, believers sin, but believers do not sin as just this way of life. And this is from God's perspective. I don't see sin as a way of life. I see all kinds of people around me that I know are unbelievers, but I don't see that their life is just constant sin. But God does, and I would say it's constant sin because, number one, they live in rejection, or as we saw under verse 4 with the idea of lawlessness, they refuse any kind of boundaries that God has set, and the boundary for them that they need is that Jesus Christ has done everything necessary for their salvation by dying on the cross for their sins, by being buried and rising again. And they want to add their works to it. They want to make Jesus an example, but not actually the one that did everything. They want in some way to think that they're going to participate in doing this or accomplishing something or earning this, baptism, good work, whatever it is. And by doing that, they are rejecting what God is doing, and therefore they're lawless with respect to God. And that lawlessness is a characteristic of their sinful nature. Now keep in mind, and I just had this conversation with somebody recently, there's not a one of us down here that's ever been good enough. I've been a believer in Christ for over 50 years. But it's not because I was good enough. In fact, even as a believer in Christ, I still don't act good enough. God did the work. Jesus Christ, in particular, did the work for us on the cross. So back to this point. So I wanted to say that because sometimes, and I had somebody that asked me this question or made this comment a few years back, and I was talking with this individual, and I shared something about the good news, and this person finally just kind of came right out and said, "You don't get it. I just am not good enough." And I said, none of us are. None of us are. If you could see inside the heart of every person that has ever walked the planet, with the exception of Jesus Christ, you'd see we are all messed up, fallen, sinful people. That's why Jesus Christ had to do it all. And this person was just kind of like, wow, taken back, like really shocked. Because I think a lot of unsaved people, when we talk to them, they think, well, you think you're good enough. Why don't you think I'm good enough? And they don't realize we're standing there as people that are sinners, that have been saved by God's grace through the work of Christ. Back to our main point. Those who are born from God, and that born from God, is, as we keep pointing out, is in the Greek, is in a perfect tense, meaning it's something that happened in the past and it has a continuing result. We remain a born one. And it says we don't practice sin as a way of life. We do sin, but it's not our way of life now. Why? Because his, referring to God in this context, and God has a definite article, so this is most likely then a reference to God the Father, and I'm just going to say it is, but we're not going to go through and prove it right now. But the very fact that we're born from him really seems to indicate this is the Father. But it says, because his seed abides or remains at ease in him. And that word abides is in the present tense, meaning it stays there. And it's okay there. It's comfortable in us. Even when we are not living as we should, his seed remains there at ease in us. Second thing about this is that the word seed is the word sperma. We get the English word sperm from it, which is simply a word for seed, but we use it for what a father contributes in the conception of a child. It's the way a father passes on some of his genetics to his children when they're conceived, which is why There are dads, you can look at their kids and you can go, yeah, I can see those kids. They all have your eyes, or they all have your nose, or man, they all have your face, whatever it might be. And so his seed here, now God's not a physical being. God is not a man. He doesn't have a physical body. He's spirit. Jesus tells us that in John 4. God is spirit. So what he's passing on to us then, and Jesus said this also in John 3, that when you're born from the ministry of the Spirit, the work of the Spirit, you're not born flesh. It doesn't change your physical nature. It changes you in the realm of spirit. So God's sperma that he passes on to us is, shall we say, some spiritual DNA. He's doing something that's causing us to take on some of his nature. By the way, that itself is a good demonstration that, I'm not trying to just pick on the Mormon church, but their doctrine is wrong that we started out as children of God. If we were already children of God, we'd already have his seed in us. But only those that have believed in Jesus Christ have a seed. We needed a seed because we didn't have it, because we were fallen. We were sinful. And so if you put this together and understand what it is that he's getting at, what he's communicating to us in this context, it's that we have God the Father's spiritual DNA, if we put it that way, in us as believers. I wanted to go over to 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 4 before we quit. And it says, "For by these promises, he has granted or given to us," and that's a perfect tense, gave, and we still have it, "these precious and magnificent," literally in the Greek it's greatest. I mean, these are the greatest promises. And why are they the greatest? That by them you have the potential to become, to be made to become, partakers, or those that fellowship or share in, and we have the divine nature. There's actually not a the, because we're not God, and we're not divinity. So we share in, we might say, in a divine kind of nature. We're sharing in God's nature, but we're only sharing in a sample of it. So we actually, because we have this seed, this spiritual DNA now from God by virtue of salvation, because of that, we have the potential to share in the divine kind of nature. It requires that we're actually living the Christian life, that we're actually sharing, this word partaker sharing. This is saying we're actively sharing it. Well, if you're living in corruption, then you're not actively sharing it. It doesn't mean you don't have that spiritual DNA. You're just not enjoying the benefit. You're not experiencing the benefit because you're not actively partaking or sharing in it. But we're able to do that because we've been born from God and his seed abides in us. And that's one of the reasons that we can't sin continuously as a way of life. We're going to come back and we're going to talk about the last part of this a little bit before we move into the next verse. Hopefully this is helpful. When people come to this and they go, well, Christians don't sin. Well, no, Christians do sin. All you got to do is take them back to the end of chapter 1, first part of chapter 2. But you can explain to them, this is because John is using a present tense, a very important tense for him to communicate what he wants. And what he's saying is, for you and I as believers, though we may sin, sin does not characterize our lives. It's not the way we are. It's just something that now happens. Or we should say, we do at times. Hope again, like I already said, I hope that that's helpful in helping you think through what God's doing, what he's done, what we experience as part of our great salvation. You can understand why Peter said the greatest promise. With that, I encourage you to have a good day in the Lord. And as always, I thank you for joining me.